This land carries the tears of prophets and the blood of generations, where every stone remembers a prayer and every grave remembers a war. Palestine and Israel are not just in conflict over land, but over history, identity, and survival. Before we dive into this powerful history, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon so you never miss the stories that shaped our world and still echo today. The history of the Palestine-Israel conflict is one of the most complicated, emotional, and enduring struggles in the modern world. At its heart lies a land that has been sacred to Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike, and which for millennia has witnessed the rise and fall of empires, religions, and nations. The struggle is not merely about territory, but about identity, memory, faith, and survival. To understand the roots of the modern war between Israel and Palestine, one must first look back at the long arc of history in which this land has always been contested. Palestine, known in antiquity as Canaan, was home to a variety of peoples thousands of years ago. The Hebrew tribes who entered the land saw it as the promised land, gifted by God to the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. In time, the Israelites established kingdoms, most famously under David and Solomon, with Jerusalem as the holy capital. The temple built by Solomon became the heart of Jewish worship. Yet this period of Jewish sovereignty was not long-lived. Successive empires, from Babylonians to Persians, from Greeks to Romans, conquered the land. Each left its mark, and each displaced or ruled over the Jewish population. In 70 CE, the Romans destroyed the Second Temple and dispersed much of the Jewish population in what became known as the diaspora. Yet Jews never entirely left. Small communities continued to live in the land, even as others scattered across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. With the coming of Islam in the 7th century, Palestine entered a new chapter. Jerusalem, already sacred to Jews and Christians, became holy to Muslims as well, because of the Prophet Muhammad's night journey and ascension. The Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque were built on the Temple Mount, creating one of Islam's most important religious centers. Under Islamic rule, first the Umayyads, then Abbasids, and later the Ottomans, the land became a multicultural society of Arabs, Christians, and Jews. For centuries, relative coexistence was possible, though not always equal. The Crusades in the 11th and 12th centuries brought fierce bloodshed, but by the late medieval period, the region had settled into the framework of the Ottoman Empire. During the long centuries of Ottoman rule, Palestine was a quiet corner of empire. Jews, Muslims, and Christians lived side by side, with the majority population being Arabic-speaking Muslims. Jews remained a minority, but their presence was never absent. By the 19th century, however, the winds of nationalism were blowing across the world, and Palestine would not remain untouched. On the one hand, Arab identity was awakening in response to Ottoman decline and European colonial ambitions. On the other hand, Jews in Europe were experiencing both the rise of nationalism and the brutal reality of anti-Semitism, pogroms, and exclusion. Out of this double movement arose two ideologies that would eventually clash violently: Arab nationalism and Jewish Zionism. World War I and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire changed everything. In 1917, the British issued the Balfour Declaration, promising to support the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, while also stating that the rights of existing non-Jewish communities should not be prejudiced. This ambiguous statement planted the seeds of future conflict. After the war, the League of Nations granted Britain the mandate over Palestine. Under British rule, Jewish immigration increased, especially as anti-Semitism and persecution in Europe intensified. The Holocaust in the 1940s gave Zionism an urgent moral force. Millions of Jews had been slaughtered, and many survivors yearned for a place where they could live safely and freely. Palestinian Arabs, however, saw the growing Jewish immigration as an existential threat. Riots, strikes, and revolts erupted in the 1920s and 1930s as Arabs protested land sales, displacement, and the prospect of losing their majority in their homeland. The Arab Revolt of 1936 to 1939 was brutally suppressed by the British, but it revealed how deeply opposition to Zionism ran among Palestinians. British attempts at compromise, including partition plans, satisfied neither side. By the 1940s, it was clear that British control was collapsing and that Jewish and Arab communities were headed for direct confrontation. In 1947, the United Nations voted to partition Palestine into two states, one Jewish, one Arab, with Jerusalem under international administration. Jews, though disappointed by the small size of the state offered, accepted the plan. Arabs rejected it outright, arguing that it violated the rights of the indigenous Arab majority, who would be forced to give up land to a newly arrived population. Violence immediately erupted, and in 1948, as the British withdrew, Jewish leaders declared the establishment of the State of Israel. The next day, armies from surrounding Arab countries, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, invaded, hoping to crush the new state. But Israel not only survived, it expanded beyond the UN partition borders, capturing much of the land allotted to Arabs. For Palestinians, 1948 was the Nakba, the catastrophe. Over 700,000 Palestinians fled or were expelled from their homes, ending up in refugee camps in Gaza, the West Bank, Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. Their villages were often destroyed, their lands absorbed into Israel, and their right to return denied. For Jews, 1948 was a miracle, the rebirth of a state after 2,000 years of exile and persecution. For Arabs, it was the dispossession of an entire people. These dual narratives, triumph and catastrophe, have defined the conflict ever since. The years after 1948 saw repeated wars. In 1956, Israel fought Egypt in the Suez Crisis, aligning with Britain and France. In 1967, tensions with Arab neighbors culminated in the Six-Day War, in which Israel captured the West Bank, Gaza Strip, East Jerusalem, the Golan Heights, and the Sinai Peninsula. For Israelis, this was another stunning victory. For Palestinians, it was a second catastrophe. Now, all of historic Palestine was under Israeli control, and another wave of Palestinians found themselves refugees. Importantly, Israel's occupation of the West Bank and Gaza began here, creating conditions that persist to this day. In 1973, Egypt and Syria launched the Yom Kippur War, hoping to regain lost territory. Although initially caught off guard, Israel repelled the attacks and emerged victorious again. Yet this war set in motion a gradual shift. Egypt under Anwar Sadat realized that peace was possible, and in 1979 signed a peace treaty with Israel, regaining the Sinai. Jordan would later follow suit in 1994. But for Palestinians, peace did not arrive. Their land remained under Israeli occupation, and their national aspirations unmet. The Palestinian national movement began to coalesce in the 1960s with the founding of the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, led by Yasser Arafat. The PLO engaged in guerrilla warfare and attacks on Israeli targets, both military and civilian. To Israel, they were terrorists. To Palestinians, they were freedom fighters. Through the 1970s and 1980s, Palestinian armed struggle continued, even as Israel tightened its grip on the occupied territories and built settlements in the West Bank and Gaza. In 1987, frustration boiled over into the First Intifada, a mass uprising of Palestinians in the occupied territories. Young people threw stones at Israeli soldiers, workers went on strike, and civil disobedience spread. Israel responded with force, leading to thousands of deaths and injuries. Yet the Intifada also shifted international opinion, putting the Palestinian struggle on the global stage in a new way. It forced Israel and the world to confront the reality of occupation. The 1990s brought hope with the Oslo Accords, signed by Israel and the PLO in 1993. For the first time, both sides recognized each other, and Israel agreed to allow the creation of a Palestinian Authority with limited self-rule in parts of the West Bank and Gaza. The world celebrated the handshake between Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat, but Oslo ultimately failed. Israel continued building settlements, Palestinians remained under military occupation, and mutual trust collapsed. In 2000, the Second Intifada erupted after Ariel Sharon's controversial visit to the Temple Mount/Al-Haram al-Sharif. This uprising was far bloodier than the first, involving suicide bombings, Israeli military incursions, and heavy casualties on both sides. The cycle of violence deepened hatred and despair. Israel built a separation barrier in the West Bank, citing security needs, while Palestinians saw it as a land grab. By the mid-2000s, another shift occurred. Israel withdrew from Gaza in 2005, removing settlements and soldiers. But in 2006, Hamas, an Islamist movement opposed to Israel's existence, won Palestinian elections. A violent split between Hamas in Gaza and Fatah in the West Bank left Palestinians divided. Since then, Gaza has been under Hamas rule, subject to Israeli blockades, repeated wars, and devastating humanitarian crises. Rockets from Gaza, Israeli airstrikes, and cycles of destruction have become tragically familiar. Meanwhile, in the West Bank, settlements have expanded dramatically, fragmenting Palestinian land and making the vision of a contiguous Palestinian state harder to achieve. Peace talks have faltered repeatedly. International efforts, from the United States to the United Nations, have produced no lasting solution. For Palestinians, the dream of independence seems ever further away. For Israelis, security concerns and political divisions have hardened positions. The 21st century has seen periodic wars in Gaza in 2008, 2012, 2014, and most recently in 2021 and beyond. Each war has killed thousands, mostly Palestinians, and left Gaza devastated. Each has also reinforced the intractability of the conflict. For Israelis, the threat of rockets and terrorism remains intolerable. For Palestinians, daily life under blockade or occupation feels like suffocation. Both sides feel existentially threatened, and both cling to narratives of victimhood and survival. Today, the Israel-Palestine conflict remains one of the most unresolved and polarizing struggles in the world. For Jews, Israel is not merely a state, but a refuge from centuries of persecution, culminating in the Holocaust. For Palestinians, Israel's existence has meant displacement, statelessness, and the loss of their homeland. The question of Jerusalem, holy to all three monotheistic faiths, remains especially explosive. International diplomacy continues to call for a two-state solution, but facts on the ground, the settlements, the separation wall, the political divisions, make it increasingly difficult. The tragedy of the conflict is that both peoples have legitimate historical claims and profound attachments to the same land. Both have suffered immensely, and both continue to live with fear and loss. The land that has seen pharaohs, prophets, crusaders, and empires is now the stage of a modern war of identity and survival. The conflict is not simply about borders, but about history, justice, and recognition, until each side can see the other not as an enemy, but as a people with equal rights to dignity and security. Peace will remain elusive. The war between Israel and Palestine is, in many ways, the story of the modern Middle East itself, a story of colonial legacies, nationalism, religion, displacement, and resilience. It is a wound that has never healed, a conflict that has outlasted generations, and a reminder that history is never just the past. It is always alive in the present.